Good morning. This hearing will come to order. The hearing is called Mitigating American Cybersecurity Risk. If you'll all stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Our final witness is Mr. Eric Rosenbach. Mr. Rosenbach is the co-director at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Mr. Rosenbach also previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. Mr. Rosenbach.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member McCaskill, other distinguished members, thank you for calling today's hearing on mitigating America's cyber risk and for the invitation to testify. And thank you also to your hardworking staff who do everything to put a hearing like this together. Just for a moment, imagine you're watching a science fiction thriller about war in the information age. During the opening scenes of this movie, sophisticated ransomware shuts down the government of a major city for more than a week. A different type of weaponized ransomware, previously deployed by North Korean cyber operators, hits the aircraft production lines at a major aerospace company. Later, the Department of Homeland Security reveals that Russian cyber operatives have compromised important aspects of the Internet's routing infrastructure. And as the plot thickens in this movie, the intelligence community confirms that Russian military intelligence operatives have in place the same malware they used to take down the Ukrainian power grid twice throughout the energy infrastructure in the United States. And as the candidates in this movie approach their midterm elections, all of the actors playing experts agree that the risk of Russian cyber and information attacks against election systems is imminent. Sitting in the movie theater watching all this unfold, you'd probably scream to yourself, why are they just sitting there watching all of this happen? But as you know, all those events are real, and they happened within the last several weeks. Against this stark reality, America must come together to build real capability and take real actions for these to address these threats. This hearing and the committee's framing of the problem we face as one of managing cyber risk is important. We will not eliminate cyber threats to America, but we can mitigate them. And to manage cyber risk, the government must lead a whole-of-nation effort in three specific areas. First, to bolster our domestic capabilities for defense. Second, to develop precise and legal offensive cyber capabilities to disrupt cyber and information attacks at their source. And finally, adopt a clear public deterrence posture. For the purposes of my oral statement, I'll just hit on some of the key aspects of that first. But cyber risk affects all corners of our economy and society. Congress can do more to incentivize the private sector to act. In particular, Congress should mandate critical infrastructure providers adopt the NIST cybersecurity framework, establish baseline standards for the manufacturers and distributors of the Internet of Things. And these devices include things such as home routers, security systems and thermostats, all of those IoT devices. And, very important, ensure that online platforms, primarily Facebook and Twitter, are not used as the tools for foreign adversary information operations. Organizations outside government must also play a role in protecting nations from cyber attack. The Defending Digital Democracy Project that I co-lead up at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, along with Robbie Mook and Matt Rhodes, works very closely with states to improve their ability to mitigate cyber risk to our election systems. It's clear from our work with the states that they take this risk very seriously. But the states simply are not equipped to face the pointy end of the spear of cyber attacks from nation-state adversaries who are spending billions of dollars and dedicating thousands of cyber operators to advance their national interests. Our research and work also found that under the leadership of Secretary Nielsen, Undersecretary Krebs, and Assistant Secretary Manfra, DHS has improved support to the states. We also saw that the department's efforts to provide real capability are important. Cybersecurity scans and risk assessments to the states have been very productive to help mitigate risk, and Congress should continue to support these. Furthermore, Congress should support the development of a DHS cybersecurity capability and provide robust resources and authorities for an operationally focused cybersecurity agency. This is more than bureaucratic box shuffling. The nation needs an expert-level organization that provides critical infrastructure operators with the support that could make a real difference in mitigating the risk of foreign cyber attack. And when it comes down to protecting elections and critical infrastructure, state governments should also look very closely at strengthening the role that the National Guard and state-run fusion centers play in election-related threat information sharing. This potent combination will provide an important hub for sharing threat intelligence and cybersecurity capability. So thank you again for the opportunity to testify. Submit my formal record my formal testimony for the record, and look forward to answering any questions you have.
At DHS's request, Congress included $26 million for the department's election work in the omnibus. Mr. Rosenbach, you're an outside observer of the work DHS has been doing, and you've been visiting election officials throughout the country. Every time I ask DHS if they need more resources, and they kind of like have to say they're doing their work with the resources they have. As an outside observer, do you think we need to scale up the DHS efforts, or is it right-sized?
Yes, ma'am. It's always easier when you're on the outside to answer money questions, but I would say I'm sure that Secretary Manfred would benefit from additional resources, both financially and personnel. Making sure that they're good and capable is always a challenge. But this is one of the most important national security issues facing the country right now. $26 million is not very much money in the country.
It's not very much money.
I also had a question, Mr. Rosenbach, for you. It is nice to see you again. Last year, you testified before the Commerce Committee on emerging cyber technologies. I serve on that committee, and we discussed the need to secure the Internet of Things at the hearing. You emphasized that the government needs to lead the effort to secure the Internet of Things. And I see in your testimony today that you argue for the establishment of baseline security standards for the manufacturers and distributors of these Internet-connected devices. Given these positions, I want to draw your attention to a bill which I was an early co-sponsor of, the Internet of Things Cybersecurity Improvement Act, which was introduced by Senate Intelligence Committee Ranking Member Mark Warner. This bill requires that when the federal government purchases an Internet-connected device for government use, the devices must adhere to specific minimum cybersecurity standards as established by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. According to one report, the federal government purchases more than $8 billion worth of Internet-connected devices each year. The idea behind this bill is that the federal government, as a major purchaser of Internet-connected devices, will lead the way on Internet of Things security and will push the consumer market to step up its security efforts as well. Mr. Rosenbach, given your advocacy for minimum standards for Internet of Things security, what's your opinion of the approach in Senator Warner's bill as a first step towards achieving the goals you laid out?
Thank you, Senator. I've looked at the bill, and I'm a very strong believer in improving the security of the Internet of Things. I think you always need to be careful about a regulatory approach, but from my professional perspective, many of the things that you lay out in that bill I think are very strong, and we need to do something in this space given the tremendous growth of devices that are connected to the Internet. Having government use its contracting leverage, I think, is a good place to start.
In your opinion, would a joint duty program that provides rotational opportunities to cybersecurity employees be beneficial to both cyber employees as well as the federal government as a whole? Maybe start at this end.
Yes, sir. I think this is a great idea. Having worked in the Department of Defense the last 8 years, it would be really important for cybercom people to be able to go help out DHS, learn from DHS as well, along with some of the other agencies. Sounds like a great idea.
Great, thank you. This could also help with hiring and retention. We find that job satisfaction goes up and folks are able to rotate, see other parts of the whole government. Would you agree in the 5 seconds remaining, the three of you?
Sir, anytime you can tell a cyber expert that they can go to NSA or Cybercom and legally hack the Iranians, North Koreans, or Russians for several years, they're going to stay in the government.
Great. Well, I'm out of time, but I appreciate your answers. Thank you.
Let me just quick follow up. Is a piece of legislation required? Or would you have the authority right now to do those rotations?
Sir, all I know is during the 7 years I was in DOD, it was very rare to see something like that happen.
Never happened.
Maybe authorities, maybe strong leadership, but
we'll
something that would facilitate
witness.
it would be helpful.
Mr. Rosenbach, as you know, Congress recently added $380 million to the omnibus to upgrade states' election technology. So, as you, I think, know, the omnibus allocates and prioritizes the money going to states based on the population of the state versus the need the state has to actually upgrade its technology. And as you know, we have the Secure Elections Act. Senator Langford and I and some of our colleagues are working on that to provide some standards for states on how they are going to actually be equipped to meet the challenges that we now know we face. So what are your thoughts about whether or not we should be prioritizing the funding to states and how those priorities should be outlined in a way that actually will achieve the goal, which is that all states will have secure elections?
Thank you, ma'am. So an interesting story for you is we were holding a national level tabletop exercise with 39 states up at Harvard the day the states were getting the news about how much money they would receive. And so they found out, they were happy, but they were unsure, even with those state election officials, how to best spend the money.
Right.
So I think it establishes what your main point is. I would say that I think the Secure Elections Act is excellent. It's bipartisan. It gives guidance on information sharing, a little bit of litigation protection, which is good, and a process for grant provisions, which goes on. I think for the states, though, first of all, you'd want to be very careful about any strict federal guidance about how to spend it, because it may be counterproductive in the relationship that DHS in particular right now is building. They've done a good job over the last year rebuilding trust with the states, and their autonomy is important. But I think there should be some general guidelines or a framework, maybe a NIST-like framework, in which trusted parties work with states to help them decide the best way to allocate that money so it has maximum effectiveness.
And as you can probably tell from my question, I'm speaking against perhaps what would seem to be the better interest of a large state. But I do know that being large should not necessarily be the priority. The priority should, I believe, be based on need as well.
Yes, ma'am.
And so looking at the priorities from that perspective. So you do support that?
Yes, ma'am, I totally agree. And here's why. Some states are much better off when it comes to protecting their election systems. Right. And remember, the Russians in particular don't have to attack every state. Right. They'll go to the weakest link. And it doesn't have to be a prominent state or a battleground state. All they have to do is undermine trust in the system and confidence in the outcome, and that could be someplace that is very weak. So we should try to address it from that perspective rather than, a thin smear everywhere.
Well said, and as we know, that was their goal, to undermine Americans' confidence in their democracy. Mr. Rosenbach, what are your thoughts about what we need if we need any more funding beyond that $380 million? Do you have some thoughts about that?
If you look back in history and the reason why there are vulnerabilities, the Help Americans Vote Act allocated money that brought about some of this technology, right. But then the funding tail after that was dry. And remember, in cybersecurity, in all tech operations, right, it was dry. There was no follow. What we don't want is one big bump of money now and then nothing in the 5 years after that. Cybersecurity is about continually mitigating risk and patching. So you need some reliable funding stream so the states know that they can patch these systems, that they have a pool of money to go to keep it secure over the long run.
That's a great point, because by the very nature of technology, we know that it is constantly evolving. There is something that is very static about technology, which it is dynamic. It's constantly changing. Do you also, I want to talk with you about the Election Assistance Commission. Do you know if they have anyone working in-house who can provide technical expertise to inform their best practices, like a chief technologist? Do you know if they have one? Because I'm not clear about that.
In our project at the Kennedy School, we've been working really closely with the EAC. Matt Masterson, when he was there, was amazing to work with, and he's now at DHS, which I think is good for the country. They have some technical expertise, but that's not their strong suit. So there would be additional help needed there.
So, in your opinion, would it be beneficial to national security, to elections, and protecting that critical infrastructure, that they would have a chief technologist position there?
A lot of elections nowadays revolve around technology in one way or another. So almost all organizations nowadays have some type of chief technology officer. That makes good sense to me.
There's been some 50 bills governing cybersecurity that have passed over the last few years, which sounds like an awful lot of action on behalf of the Congress. And I've seen some reports from your GAO report about areas of improvement to implement some of those bills. But I'd just like to each of you to address as you can. What else is there? Do you have, for instance, all the tools that are necessary? Whether or not you have the ability to implement them right now, are there other things? 50 bills sounds like a lot, but there's a lot going on in this world. And are there other things that Congress and this committee should be looking at that would help you in this world, whether it's the Department of Defense, whether it's Homeland Security? So if each of you take just a moment with that, I'd appreciate it.
Sir, it's always easier when you're on the outside, but I think that you all could start by clarifying the committee oversight structure for the Department of Homeland Security. So this wouldn't be passing a bill back on the executive branch, but it would be dealing maybe in the co-equal branch of Congress and cleaning things up here. I was speaking with Secretary Monfort beforehand. She said she's already testified, I think, 15 times this year. Having been an Assistant Secretary of Defense, you spend a crazy amount of time preparing to come and work with y'all, which is really important, but it's time taken away from doing operational, real things. So I know that's a hard thing, but it's worth mentioning. I think that capability and talent are the two most important things in government, and bureaucracy is deadly to capability and talent, even in the Department of Defense, where we have a huge budget and a lot of really motivated people. DHS has that as well. In some ways, maybe there's a bill that could do away with a lot of the reporting requirements that GAO then grades Secretary Manfort on. That probably also would be helpful. So I love government. I'm at the School of Government. I'm a big fan of that, but sometimes too much government keeps you from getting the real stuff done.
Mr. Rosenbach, you mentioned in your testimony that, quote, bolstering private sector cyber defenses without regulation should be a priority. I agree with that. How important is it to enable the private sector to innovate and commercialize the next generation of cybersecurity technologies without a technology mandate?
Senator, I think it's really important. And during the time I was in the Department of Defense, in the beginning, I think NSA Cybercom had better capabilities than the private sector. If I look now 8 years later, it's not even close. The private sector moves more quickly, advances more quickly. We need to be able to rely on them in a way that helps the country in a broader national security sense as well.
In a public sector, how should we be communicating to the public in terms of cybersecurity, the steps we're taking, and what assurances can we give them that we are addressing cybersecurity sufficiently, first in the public sector, then in the private sector, both in regard to state actors, be that Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and non-state actors, terrorist groups, for example. How should we be talking about what we're doing and its adequacy and whether or not they can be reassured and where they should have concerns?
Sir, I'll be very quick because I know you're over. I'll say the most important thing to me is that you can't expect the Department of Homeland Security or the private sector to be defending against advanced nation-state threats. You need the Department of Defense and the intel community to be operating outside U.S. borders to take on adversaries before they hit us. The idea that we would let someone attack our democracy and our election system and there'd be almost no price to pay for that still is crazy to me. And I was in a job where I probably should have done more. We as an administration should have done more, but the country needs to do more. The private sector, there's a great and thriving market in the cybersecurity market, and they can make money and make a big difference. However, there are parts of the tech sector that need to internalize that they have a responsibility to the public to do more. That's primarily social media platforms right now. There's, I think, a little momentum in a positive way, but we need to see more there. Information operations by nation states will continue to get worse unless they and the government both do something that's a little more assertive.
If you destroy computers through electronic beams, we call that a cyber attack. When if you destroy those computers with a bomb, I mean, that'd be for sure an act of war. I mean, do we need a definition? Could we even come up with one?
This may sound overly simplistic, but for about the past 10 years, I've always heard people debate whether we need cyber doctrine or what cyber war is. And in my mind, in all of the White House Situation Room meetings where I sat through, people knew what a real attack was. The problem is, are you going to do something about it? It's not in the definition. You know it. It's are you willing then to take the action to go back and.
And I realize there's a spectrum here, but what about the challenge of attribution? I mean, you retaliate, you respond, and if you don't have the attribution correct, that's a real problem. And doesn't that often, I mean, we just saw that with the use of chemical weapons.
Yes, sir.
And when we finally could attribute it and we had a high level of confidence, we responded, but
Yeah.
it's more difficult in cyber, isn't it?
Yes, sir. It's difficult. I would say this is something that has really changed over the past several years, too. Attribution is not as difficult as people think. The private sector is very good at it. If you look at Mandiant, CrowdStrike, firms like that, NSA is very good at it, even some of the experts at DHS. And so you'll never have 100% confidence, just like in a terrorism strike. You may not know definitively, but most times now, you can have pretty good attribution, and you can have it pretty quickly.
So let me ask you, what kind of cyber attacks actually keep you awake at night? I mean, this is where I'm going to get into the prioritization, the things that we really need to be concerned about, which means, that's what we need to prioritize our assets and our attention toward as well. I'll stay with you, Mr. Rosenbach.
Yes, sir. In your opening statement, you talked about maybe the election threat is a little overemphasized, and in some ways that may be right, but I worry the most about is a combination of info attacks and cyber attacks done by any of those nation states. The Russians were successful in some ways, but that won't be lost on Kim Jong-un or the Iranians, and they'll want to go after our and other democracies. They can do things that undermine trust in democratic systems that aren't just about elections. In the financial sector, it could be.
Don't we play into their hands in terms of undermining by literally blowing it out of proportion? I'm not in any way, shape, or form minimizing the seriousness of it. I mean, we've
Yes.
seen what they did in Crimea, Ukraine.
Yes,
we,
sir, right.
Basically an act of war against Montenegro if it would have
Yes.
succeeded.
I totally agree, and I didn't mean to mischaracterize your statement. Right,
having a
but
discussion here.
I totally agree with you. Other things I worry about that are very important to the way the economy and the country runs are GPS, vulnerable to attack. Other systems like that these advanced bad guys know we depend very heavily on. And in the Department of Defense, we always worried that someone would take out some of our network that would prevent us from responding in an operational way. So just an attack on our weapon systems, which are very network dependent, always kept me up at night.
What about attacks on financial system?
Yes, sir, right.
We've seen them shut down the electrical grid in Ukraine.
Twice, right.
I mean, these
for
are
sure.
existential, just about, correct?
Yes, sir. Those are all real things. With the financial sector, they realize that a loss would hurt them. They tend to spend way more money than another sector. So that's positive. They tend to be very good. So there are a lot of things that worry me. It's just on the spectrum. But again, your point about the fact that we're watching all of these things happen. The Russians take down the power grid in Ukraine twice. And then our response, and this was during the time I was in there, was weak to none. That's not a good way to improve our overall security at a national level.
Were we unaware of the fact that the owner, the head of the company was KGB trained? I mean, were we unaware of that for years? Was that just kind of slip by unnoticed?
No, sir. That's something that's been widely known. Having very granular intel on things like that is hard. And the Department of Defense, we were always much more skeptical about Kaspersky, and so I think very rarely used it. The point about Kaspersky that is worth maybe internalizing is probably the best marketing person for Kaspersky was Edward Snowden, because all around the world, people then doubted whether you could trust American cybersecurity firms, and a large part of the world decided they would trust Kaspersky more. Right. So that's a very unfortunate thing, but at least the rest of the world now is under surveillance by Kaspersky, but not as much of the United States.
I think the response from both of you is that, no, we do have the authorities, we have the laws. I'll ask, do we have too many? Are there overlapping laws? Are there conflicts in those laws that create problems for you? Or just the sheer volume? Again, some of these, we're not complying. It doesn't sound like we're complying at all. I mean, on the 0 to 10 scale, it's probably 0. Is that because we've just passed too many, that it's taken the department's eye off the ball?
Sir, I know when you're in government, it's often hard to say something officially on the record about there being too many laws. So this is what I would say. When I was Chief of Staff at the Department of Defense, the last year, the National Defense Authorization Act had 1,500 pages of new laws. The year before that, it had 1,400 pages of new laws. And the year before, and if you go through, and you put all those together, it really binds the hands of executives and government, no matter what the department. In the case of DHS, when they have all these overlapping jurisdictions, it makes it even more complicated, because then they'll be testifying on maybe the same law or theme for several different committees. So I think there's something here that is not right about the way government is working, from my humble perspective.
I don't know too many organizations that would recommend having a 535-member board of directors. So let's just kind of go through affecting the vote tallies. How probable is that?
I don't know anything from intelligence. What I do know is how good the Russian intelligence services are, and all of the things they did to the Department of Defense, even in classified networks. I personally find it hard to believe that we would always be able to detect whether the Russian intelligence services were penetrating into that. Here's a scenario. You know, sir, how dependent a lot of the states are on vendors. There's no way those vendors' networks are so secure that the Russians hypothetically couldn't get in supply chains. So there is not a great risk, that I completely agree with, but there will always be some.
Which is one of the reasons my voting, we do it on a paper ballot, and we put it in an optical scanner, and you got the paper trail right there. I mean,
that's right.
So a lot of this, one of my favorite sayings is, all change is not progress, all movement is not forward.
Correct.
So as we've upgraded to more electronic voting machines, I'm glad that my voting precinct, we don't do that.
And if I could say something, I don't want to interrupt the flow of your questions, but the folks from Wisconsin and the election team there came to the Kennedy School and literally have been probably near perfect partners in terms of all of the states who we've worked for. We had a team that went to Wisconsin, looked at what they were doing, learned from them. They came and helped us design a tabletop exercise for the other states. They participated in our tabletop exercise.
So
it's those people who are very good about thinking about resilience, and they get the problem. That's what gives me the most confidence, because they're there, they're working on it. It's not in the abstract that they're just systems around.
There is voter fraud.
Yeah.
How extensive? My own mind, probably not all that extensive, except in a very close election, maybe to affect the outcome. Mr. Rosenbach, either agree, disagree, or dispute it. What are your thoughts on that?
No, sir, I agree. And, our project is just one small thing. It's not the Department of Homeland Security, but we've been trying to do the same thing. So we have these playbooks where state and local election officials see all these best practices. They've been super receptive to that. They understand that this is a system of systems. It's actually least often the case that we worry about the election, the electronic voting machine itself, as opposed to everything else that could be in there. And the way that you respond to that, just as you mentioned, is really important in the incident response. Even if there were hypothetically something, if the Secretary of State with the local election officials came out and explained what may have happened, how you mitigated for that, then the public is much more likely to say, okay, this looks like something I can trust. The bad guys tried to get in. Maybe they did a little bit. Here's all the evidence. We've found that public communications aspect is more challenging than any of the technical part, because probably for very good reason, most state election officials are not really eager to get out in front of a camera and talk to the press about something that's as complex as a possible cyber info attack.
But again, how would that be manifest? How would that show up? You potentially go in your polling place and your name's not on it. Or a bunch of people, names are on there that shouldn't be on there. Also something that could come to light in the election, but that's exactly what, for example, country like Russia would be trying to do, is try and disrupt the election, delegitimize it, produce a lack of confidence, correct?
Yeah, yes, sir, that's right. And in our research, we found that, again, election officials are used to doing business continuity planning. They're used to being resilient, because something bad always happens in an election, the weather, electricity. And so the backup of the voter files, in most cases, was something they were doing on a regular basis anyway. And even if, depending on the state, on election day, a certain name wasn't on there, they have established SOPs for how to deal with those things. So again, that's another, risk limiting type function in the overall risk mitigation strategy that you would use.
My point in spending a fair amount of time on this is to lay out the facts, lay out the reality, provide some level of comfort that there are a lot of checks and balances in this process. I think the decentralized nature of our elections provides even greater security. So is this a serious issue? Sure, and we need to take it seriously, and we need to strengthen those controls, but I don't think we should blow this out of proportion and call into question the legitimacy of either past or future elections. That's kind of my main point. And if you want to make a final comment on that before I move my next points. Mr. Rosenbach?
Sir, the only thing I'd say is I completely agree that this is not about the previous election, that it did not impact the outcome. The point for me is the idea that any other nation could or is designing to impact the outcome of our elections and influence our democracy is something that I think upsets every American and is exactly
I agree.
what you're saying. That.
When you have to have the private sector liaison or plugging into some form of government, you want a civilian agency like DHS, and yet we have resistance to that. Can you let's lay out the reality of what we're dealing with here.
I really have no idea why someone would object to MPPD changing their name. That seems to me one of these extremely crazy cases of government where an organization can't even rename themselves. We should probably do a case study at the Kennedy School about how inane this can be sometimes.
And requires an act of Congress. No, again, it's bizarre to me.
Yes, sir. I mean, it's not you, but people can pass all these laws about DHS and they can't even name themselves. Again, humble outsider, but it seems crazy.
Okay, we'll clip that testimony too.
It's interesting. If I think back to when I was first Deputy Assistant Secretary, which was almost 8-9 years ago now, we did not get along with DHS. And no offense to Jeanette, but DHS was kind of a mess. And so there were a lot of people saying, put DOD in charge of domestic cybersecurity, which would have been a horrible idea. We worked it out. There was one very memorable time when we were here in the Senate and we did a tabletop exercise for the entire full Senate. And Senator Mikulski, after the tabletop exercise, pointed to the cabinet and the Obama administration, said, who's in charge when there's a huge cyber catastrophe? And no one there could actually understand. And so we worked through that. Things are much better now.
Could they answer that question now?
It's very clear. It's actually DHS. In terms of incident response, they know that they're in charge now. In terms of the hit back, that was DOD, but even those things weren't clear at the time, so there's been a lot of progress, which I think is good. That said, it now comes to the capability point. And so when I talk about an idea I have about DHS having more capability to do domestic cybersecurity things that could help critical infrastructure, that's what gives them cachet with the private sector and with others, is if they bring something to the table.
Mr. Rosenbach, are you a glass half full or glass half empty?
I pride myself on being an optimist. Maybe that's because I lived through like the last 8 years, seeing all this bad stuff happen. I actually think the private sector is closer to 7, maybe 7.5. And that's primarily because the cybersecurity industry and the tech sector are moving very quickly, and there are a lot of options out there that mitigate.
But not everyone in the private sector. I mean, there are a lot of people down there at zero.
Yes,
problem,
yes,
right?
Of course. I think the government is 5. If you said Department of Defense, I'd say, okay, well, of course we're better than everyone else, but that's easy to do when you can tell people what to do and you have a $700 billion budget. But overall, I think the government is probably 5, and that includes government policy about national security decisions, when we'll respond to stuff, when we'll attribute things,
Again, I want to thank all of you for your testimony, for indulging my lengthy questions here. I think this is an excellent hearing. And again, I just want to thank you. This hearing is adjourned.